In this video we're going to walk around Trieste in Italy and look at some Roman remains, and I'm going to talk about the decline of the West. So one question I want to pose here is the West actually in decline? Recently a lot of people have been talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, and the reason for that is that people are saying just like Rome fell, the West is now falling. So I want to examine that a little bit. I actually have a theory that a lot of the problems that we're seeing now are really due to one particular cause, and in many cases people are actually mistaking symptoms of the underlying problem for the underlying problem itself. So I'll explain what I mean by all this later on. So we've just left Piazza Unità in Trieste, big square by the sea, Unity Square, and we're walking through a little market here. And what we're going to do is we're going to make our way to a Roman amphitheatre that's just around the corner here. And then we're going to go up to the top of the San Giusto Hill in Trieste and take a look at some Roman remains up there. So why do people even think that the West is declining? The West being basically Europe, or places where Europeans have gone and have set up a European style civilization. That's what we call the West. I used to think this idea of some sort of decline was nonsense, because I just thought, well, some things are getting better and some things are getting worse. But now I'm not so sure. And when I look back, I can identify the first point in my life when I actually thought things were better in the past in some particular regard. And that was when I was about 12 years old, and my mum used to take me to the local library, and she tried to get me interested in chemistry because my dad was an industrial chemist. And I did get very, very interested in chemistry, so I was reading at first a lot of children's chemistry books, and I noticed that the chemistry books that were written for children before about, let's say, the early 1960s were generally very exciting, very interesting, and the ones that were written after early 1960s were usually really boring. So the ones that were written after about 1960 tended to focus on school curricula, and they had exam questions in and that sort of thing, whereas the ones that were written before about 1960 seemed to be just written for the pure fun of chemistry, which to my mind is how a children's chemistry book should be. So that's a really small example of how things have changed, and I think there was some sort of a change that took place, in my view, somewhat for the worse around the beginning of the 60s. So not everything got worse, obviously a lot of things got better, but some things definitely deteriorated around that point. And we can see another example of that on this street, because if you look at a building that was built before about 1960, or certainly before 1950, usually it's beautiful, or at least it looks nice, and the older the building is, the nicer it looks. On this street we can see lots of buildings that were built like a really long time ago, like maybe even a century ago or more, and they look pretty nice, like those buildings right at the end of the street. But this stuff that was built in the 50s and probably more likely 60s, 70s, like this huge block of flats in front of us, it's pretty ugly, to be honest. So I definitely think architecture has deteriorated. Now here we can see a Roman amphitheatre on the right hand side. I'm going to turn and look at it. This is 2,000 years old, more or less. And, well, I would say it's the prettiest thing on the street, even though it's in ruins. And look at that building next to it, that's not so nice. And that's probably from the 60s, I guess, 70s. So yeah, a lot of things have gone downhill, but we can't be completely negative because after all, before the 50s we had 2 world wars, and that definitely wasn't good. Now, there is one thing that more than anything else makes me think that perhaps the West genuinely is in decline, and that is something called TFR, total fertility rate. The TFR is the average number of children that a woman has in her lifetime. We're going to go up these stairs here and we're going to look at more Roman remains at the top. This isn't actually the nicest way to get up the hill, but any way you go, as long as you keep going upwards, basically works. So let's go up here where we'll see some really nice old buildings and take a look up here. Now, if you imagine that the sex ratio is 1:1, so for every woman there is one man, or for every boy there is one girl that's born. If you imagine that, it's not actually true, but if you imagine that, and suppose you wanted the population to remain absolutely stable, so you didn't want more people or fewer people, and we're going to exclude immigration and emigration and wars and things like that. Let's just imagine everyone basically lives in a country, no one leaves or enters, and you want the population to remain steady. Well, women are then 50% of the population. So on average, every woman's going to have 2 children to make the population remain stable. That's got to be the average number of children per woman to keep a stable population. So you'll get some women that don't have any children. You'll get some women that have like 4 or whatever. But if that averages out to 2 children per woman, then you'll have a stable population. Because one way of thinking about this is that for every woman there's one man. So that woman has to not only replace herself, she has to replace the man as well, who can't give birth, right? That's where we get this TFR of 2 from. So total fertility rate, in other words, the total number of children that a woman has over her lifetime on average, would have to be 2 to maintain the population level if we had a 1:1 sex ratio. Now, in actual fact, more males are born than females. So the sex ratio is actually about 1.05 or even 0.6 or 0.7 in favour of males. More males are born slightly than females. And people think the reason for this is that at every age, males are more likely to die. That's even than females. That's even true for fetuses. So nature has apparently compensated for that by making more embryos male than female, slightly more. So if you've got 1.05 males for every female on average, that means that to maintain a steady population, you've got to have a total fertility rate of 2.1. So the average number of children that a woman would have to maintain a steady population will be 2.1 children. Obviously, no woman is going to have 2.1 children, but that's the average mathematically. Now, the actual total fertility rate in Europe is pretty low. It's somewhere around 1.5. So in the UK, it's apparently, according to Wikipedia, it's 1.6. In Italy, it's 1.3. And there are also some Asian countries like China and Japan where the TFR is also really low. So in Japan, and I think China as well, it's about 1.3. And that means that if you don't have immigration, you have a rapidly shrinking population. Of course, in Japan, there isn't that much immigration. In the West, we have huge immigration. So while one population shrinks, the population of people whose ancestors are mainly European, while that shrinks, we're bringing in more people from other parts of the world. Now, I would say that kind of looks like a decline. So if you look at Japan and Imagine if Japan had a lot of immigration, let's say English people were going to Japan, and you saw that with every passing year there were fewer people who were, let's say, ethnically Japanese, and there were more and more English people in Japan. I think you'd be justified in saying Japan was declining, right? So you could argue that this is a decline. Even if you think immigration is extremely positive and it's a great thing and you have no reservations about it, you could still call that a kind of decline. There's a missing cat just there. So, question is, when did that decline start and why is it happening? And it actually started a long time ago. The TFR of Europe actually began to decline around about 200 years ago, around about 1800, very roughly. The decline began in different places at different times. Now, the TFR was very high. It was probably in Europe as a whole, it was maybe around 5 or 6 children per woman, although you have to remember that many of those did not survive because infant mortality used to be extremely high. It used to be common that a family would have children that had just died and hadn't made it to 10 years old or whatever. Babies used to die a lot. Now, mercifully, it's relatively uncommon for a baby to die. It still happens, but it's uncommon. We finally made it to the top, and on the left here are some Roman remains, which we're going to take a look at shortly. Now, in about 1980, the TFR in Europe dipped below the replacement rate and stayed below. So it declined all the way from around 1800, carried on declining until it was below replacement rate. In the United States, I think it's kind of scraping around maybe a little bit below replacement level, but you have to remember that many countries in Europe and in the West generally, so in Europe we've got the UK that has very high immigration levels, and the US has very high immigration levels. So it's certainly not true that all the people in the West are of European ancestry. And actually some immigrant groups have persistently high TFRs for cultural reasons. So if you were to subtract those high TFRs of some immigrant groups, you would actually get a even lower TFR for ethnic Europeans. There in the distance we can see the sea, but it's a bit of a grey day. It doesn't look so nice today. There's a little bar in the corner just here as well. But we're going to take a look at the Roman remains up straight ahead there. There's a cathedral actually, and that's of kind of late medieval origin. And directly ahead is a kind of late medieval castle. Let's take a look at the really old stuff though. So the TFR, it's a thing that it's been going down for a really long time, but it could go up again at any moment. Who knows? Maybe. So I don't think it's proof that the kind of European ethnic group as a whole is declining, but in a sense it is, in as much as there are fewer and fewer people of European ethnicity with every passing year. And you might regard that as a good thing. I'm not taking a position on it. I'm European, so I don't really want Europeans to die out. But, you know, it's a kind of decline in numerical terms at the very least, right? So why is this happening? Let's first go up on here and take a look at these columns. These columns are actually about 2,000 years old. They're Roman columns, which kind of surprised me because they're not what I expect Roman columns to look like. If you look at the way they're built, it seems like they're built with cement or concrete on the inside, and that's clad with bricks. And I'm guessing originally there would have been plaster on the outside that would have made them look like they were carved out of marble or limestone. Well, actually, the Romans did use cement and concrete, and this is apparently Roman concrete that's in the middle of these columns, and those are Roman bricks, and the plaster coating, which was probably there at one time, I assume, has just been eroded by the weather. So it's a weird idea to think that there was a really powerful, highly organised, somewhat brutal civilization here 2,000 years ago, and now we're just looking at the remains of it. Right up here on top of the hill is actually where the Romans first began to build a settlement, which later became Trieste. And this monument here, we've actually got, I think it's 3 soldiers carrying a sort of comrade, while another soldier protects them with a shield. And this is a monument to the people who died in basically the First World War. It says to the fallen in the War of Liberation, 1915 to 1918, and that's when basically Trieste came under Italian control, so it was liberated from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not the Nazis, because that came later on. And now we're going to go down the hill and we're going to make our way to the Cafe San Marco, which we saw in the first video on this channel. So why has the TFR fallen? And there are lots of proximate reasons for that. I'm going to name 3 important ones. One reason is that thanks to improving medical technology and better organisation in some ways of society, fewer children die. We have much lower infant mortality. So let's say you want to have some children. Let's say you're a married couple, you want to have children, and you want 2 of them. Then you can have 2 children and be fairly sure that you are going to end up with 2 children. Whereas in the past, that wasn't the case. It was quite likely some of your children would die, and if you only had 2, they might both die. So people would have more children. Grim though this calculus sounds, they would have more children than necessary, just in case some of them died. And of course that's still going on in some parts of the world, probably where we have much higher infant mortality still, although it is rapidly declining all over the world. Another factor is of course improved birth control, particularly around whenever the female hormone birth control pill came out, was that the 60s? So that has been a factor. It makes it easier to control how many children you have. But I don't think contraception has actually ever been the driving factor behind how many children people have. On the whole, people can simply use other methods to control their fertility, and they have done historically. Otherwise, they would have way more than 5 or 6 children. And another factor is that, well, we've got child labour laws, and you're not supposed to have children and put them to work on your farm or whatever. And so that means that children have gone from being seen as a resource to being seen as a burden. Now, I'm not saying people think of children as purely a burden. Obviously they don't. But in a sense they are. They're a financial burden now. Whereas in the past, once your children got to a certain age, they could start working on your farm or whatever, and they would help bring money in. So people were incentivized to have a greater number of children, to look after them in their old age, to get the work done on the farm and so on. And we don't really do that anymore, partly because of the child labour laws and the changing way that we view children. But these are all proximate factors, and I would suggest that there's another factor behind all of these that is basically really calling the shots, because otherwise you've got to say, well, there are lots of reasons why people are having fewer children, and they all mysteriously point in the same direction towards fewer children. I think really the main driver behind this is arguably population density, because as population density increases, people go from a mentality of thinking, well, we really need more children to grow our civilization and to fill up all the empty space and get things done and build cities. They go from thinking that to thinking, wow, are my children going to be able to find a house? Aren't there enough people already? Aren't there too many people already? They're going to start thinking more and more like that, and they're naturally going to tend to have fewer children. And certainly I don't think people feel the same pressure today to have children that they did even, let's say, 40 years ago, even when I was a child. And even if you don't agree that that's what has happened, you have to think, well, there would come a point where that would happen. If the fertility rate, if the TFR was above replacement rate and the population grew and grew and grew, eventually you would fill all the available space, or you'd run out of food, and people would desperately and feverishly start trying to have fewer children because it would become like an emergency situation. That's assuming lack of food didn't just kill them in a famine. So, clearly we would eventually reach a point where people wanted to have fewer children, and I would suggest we're kind of heading towards that, and that's why the TFR is going down, really, ultimately. Now that has some interesting consequences, because if you have fewer children, well, the children that already exist, they get older, and what you end up with is an older population, and that's what we've got now. Japan is, I think, the most elderly population in the whole world, and Italy, I believe, is the second oldest. That's partly because many Italians have left. The European Union makes it easier for them to leave Italy if they want to find more opportunities somewhere else. Schengen zone, they can just go and live and work somewhere else within Europe, and many of them have actually done that. But also it's because Italians are having so few children, with this TFR of about 1.3. It's very, very low. And if you look at some of the young people now, they will say things like society is pale and stale, European society. And they will say that because of this, they want to bring in more immigrants and make it more vibrant. They use the word enriched. And, what's that about? Because if you think about it, it's pretty strange. It's sort of racist. Because what's this pale referring to? It's referring to skin colour. They're talking about their fellow Europeans, right? Ethnic Europeans, I mean. So why do they feel like that? Why do they feel that the kind of European society that has developed here over centuries, before we got these modern big waves of immigration from outside of Europe, like we have now, why do they think that society is boring? And this kind of hit me like a revelation. It's kind of obvious when you think about it, but people don't think about it. And the fact is, they think European society is boring because it's elderly. That's the reason for it. And that explains a lot of other things as well. Consider the rate of cultural innovation. So if you look at music, the 50s had a very distinct style in popular music in Europe, and so did the 60s and the 70s. They all had their individual styles, and the 80s. When we got to the 90s, people starting to say, well, what are we kind of going to do next? And they were starting to look back at the 60s and 70s and create music that sounded kind of retro. But then when we get into the 2000s, you don't really see big changes. I don't think there's a huge difference between popular music made in 2005 and popular music made in 2015, in the same way that there's a huge difference between let's say 55 and 65 or 75 or 85, right? And why is that? Well, you don't get cultural innovation without young people. I think it's as simple as that. So, yeah, we're out of ideas, but why are we out of ideas? Well, because we're old. And I'm not saying older people, I mean, I'm almost 50. I'm not saying older people can't have ideas, but if you have a society where the average age is hovering around 50 or something, you're not going to get huge cultural innovation. And if you look at previous waves of cultural innovation, you look at, I don't know, punk rock or rock and roll or the synthesizer movement in the 80s, they were all heavily resisted by older people. They always said, oh, this is not real music, or it's just a noise, or it's awful, or it's degenerate or something. They always resisted it. And it was the young people who took it forward. Without the young people, you don't get cultural innovation. And I think that's why we don't really have any now. Another interesting effect of the age of our population, which, as I've explained, I think is ultimately due to population density, which brings about a low TFR, is that young people will see the idea of getting a job as being very boring because the nature of work has changed. If you imagine that you're going to get a job and you're going to work maybe with a few family members or friends and maybe be kind of self-employed, or maybe you're going to work for a bigger company but there's going to be a lot of young people in that company. Let's call that situation A. Now let's contrast that with situation B, where a job means going and working for a big company. So going and working as a sales assistant in a huge clothing chain, or working in an office or something, and you've got huge layers of management above you, large numbers of people who are older than you, more senior than you, that are calling the shots. Call that situation B. I think we've moved somewhat from situation A to situation B. So the young people who are going into the world of work now, they feel they're just going to be bossed around by boring old people, and it doesn't appeal to them. So you can kind of understand why many of them are reluctant to do it. And in Japan, we even see this phenomenon of young people just staying at home, living with their parents, particularly young men, and not getting a job and not going out and not wanting to do anything at all. Now, I could go on for a long time talking about different effects of the aging population, but the final thought I want to leave you with is, supposing you're young and you live in a village or you live in the countryside, you're going to feel that you're surrounded by elderly people, which wouldn't have been the case as much in the past. In the past, there would have been more people your own age there. Therefore, you're probably going to want to go to the town where everything's happening and there are more people your own age. But towns are alienating, and they also have a negative natural growth rate. Towns only grow because people move into towns. They don't grow through having a TFR above the replacement rate of 2.1. So young people move into the towns, and then they might be more alienated there than they were even in the countryside, because although there are more young people there, people in towns have to get used to not interacting with each other as much. Even in some of the villages where I grew up, if you walk past someone on the street, you might say hello to them. You're not going to do that in a town unless you know them, because people can't all be saying hello to each other in the towns. There's too many people, no one will get anything done. So you get this phenomenon whereby young people feel alienated in the countryside and they move to the town, and in some cases they become just more alienated. And I think this has played into the big rise of alienation that we've seen. So even in the 90s, there was that French author, I've forgotten his name, but he wrote a book called Atomized, and I read that book at the time and I thought, this is a horrible, depressing sleaze fest. But I now think actually it was quite prescient. We were already talking in the 90s about how everyone was atomized, how they were kind of alienated, and that book just envisages a thoroughly horrible, soulless, alienated life, which is what many of us seem to be heading towards, particularly I think among young people. You can see that rates of loneliness and therefore also depression are on the rise among young people. So this isn't exactly very cheery, but I think it's kind of fascinating. I don't know what can be done about it. Maybe nothing. Maybe we are seeing the kind of end of a civilization. Maybe there's nothing we can do about it. Maybe it's part of some natural cycle. I don't know. But I think it's fascinating that you can actually explain a lot of the attitudes of young people, particularly the attitudes that older people tend to decry, just by considering the age of society. And the age of society, the relatively elderly nature of society, has come about because of this low TFR, because I think of rising population densities. It's quite hard to do anything about it because you can't grow a population indefinitely ultimately that comes down to physics. It's not possible. At some point, the TFR has to come down, whether it had to be now or whether it could have been later on. It has to come down eventually, and then you are going to get an older society, and then you are going to see many of these effects, alienation, disenchantment, that we are now seeing among the young. If we are going to solve that problem, at the very least, I think we first have to understand how it comes about, because if we're just, for example, imagining that negative attitudes in young people have come about because of, I don't know, some French philosophers from the 60s or whatever, then I would say we're on the wrong track. Like, there have been plenty of philosophers coming out with awful ideas, but they've found a very receptive audience because of the underlying changing nature of society. Now, in Japan, of course, they've decided they're not going to have much immigration. Immigration, whether it's good or it's bad, it does at least help to keep the society more youthful. So, for example, if you think about medical care, statistically, as people get older, they require more and more medical care. Obviously, that's not true of everyone. Someone's always going to say, I'm 80 and I've never been to a doctor or something. Yeah, okay, but statistically, the older you get, the more medical care you require. That is a fact. And there are many people who are elderly who unfortunately require extensive care. That increases with age, the likelihood of that happening. So who's going to do the caring? Other elderly people, maybe to an extent, but you're going to end up relying on young people. So to maintain a functioning health service, or at least functioning in the way that people want it to function, you need a lot of young people. That is unfortunately the case. And people are demanding that our politicians maintain the health service and make sure everyone can get treatment, even as we get older and older. So the politicians, what are they doing? They're bringing in huge numbers of immigrants in the West as a whole. And I think this is one of the reasons why, because some of the things that people are demanding from them actually kind of require a lot of young people. And since we're not having young people, we're not creating them, they've got to bring them in from outside. That's what's going on in the heads of politicians. So you have to remember, politicians are kind of psychopathic. So if they think they can get away with telling people that they are reducing immigration, which a lot of people want, while at the same time increasing it, and thereby, in their minds, hopefully helping to maintain health services, although whether it actually works or not, who knows, but I think that's what they believe they're doing. Well, that's what they're going to do, because this is the minds of politicians. So that's what I wanted to talk about in this video, just some reflections on this alleged decline of the West. I don't really know whether it is a decline or not, but in some senses it is, because there are fewer and fewer ethnic Europeans with every passing year. That is a literal fact, and I find it fascinating. Are we present at the fall of a kind of empire, a civilization? I don't know. You have to remember, when the Roman Empire fell, the people didn't all just disappear. Some groups of people declined, others rose and increased, and people carried on living, just the form of civilization changed. So I guess that's what we're potentially talking about here. So here we're back on Cesare Battisti Street, which we saw in the last video. We just walked past September 20th Street, which we saw in the last video, and we're going to head up here to San Marco Cafe, that famous haunt of Italo Svevo and James Joyce and others. There are many more topics that I'd like to cover. The way I conceive of this channel is I'm going to be walking around showing you things, and I'm going to talk about some stuff that I've been kind of dying to talk about for ages, but I could never really find the right outlet for it. We're probably going to be talking about stuff like free will and consciousness, but I had to kind of get this off my chest because I've been thinking about it for a while, and it's kind of a taboo topic for various reasons. People are going to accuse you of bigotry if you try to talk about immigration in anything other than extremely positive terms. I don't think I'm a bigot. I'll leave that up to you to decide. I don't really want to convince anyone of anything here. I just want to talk about what's happening rather than what people should do. So it's not a political channel. I just want to understand some things like society and the nature of human existence and so on. In this video I haven't got on to talking about science, because science I think has undergone really interesting and largely negative changes, although not entirely, since the 60s, kind of reflective of what I think I saw in those children's chemistry books back when I was 12 years old. Maybe we'll get onto that another time. If we turn just about here, we can see the Cafe San Marco coming up in a second, and that's where we're going to end this video. Do join me again next time when we're going to be talking about something else. I haven't decided what yet. Thanks for listening and have a good week.